All right. So when we look at our Great Depression unit, we started by looking at kind of the causes of the Great Depression. And chapter 22, section 1 is actually entitled The Nation's Sick Economy. And it kind of looked at several things that were going on within the United States at the beginning of the Great Depression. So we talked about things like superficial prosperity and how through the 1920s, um, there was this kind of superficial prosperity that kind of built up in the country where there were a lot of other troubling signs underneath. People were buying things on credit. They didn't necessarily have the money for it, which kind of led to an unequal distribution of wealth. We have problems in certain industries, um, certain key industries like the steel industry, also, coal mining. There were problems with those industries, and then there were problems within the farm sector as well. Where farmers were producing too much, and industry was actually producing too much as well, which led to an oversupply of goods, which means prices went down. And part of that oversupply too was due to the fact that World War I had ended, and a lot of the things that we were producing, that was previously being bought by European countries wasn't being purchased by them anymore, as they struggled with their own economic problems. So we have that going on, and again, like I mentioned just a second ago, we have increasing amounts of consumer debt, where people were buying things on credit, which ultimately it leads to a couple of things. But the big thing here that it led to is at some point, in the late 1920s, people began to tighten their belt and they began to buy less. And so when you're buying less with overproduction, that only leads to more supply, which only leads to more price declines, which means people and businesses were losing money. And then a relatively new phenomenon in the late 1920s was speculation in the stock market. And again, where people were kind of hedging their bets on making investments in the stock market. And they were investing without really looking at the risk. And one of the big things that they were doing is they were buying stocks on margin or with credit, basically, where they would borrow money to pay for the price of the stock. Now, as long as the stock price keeps going up, there's nothing wrong with this practice. However, we know in 1929, on Black Tuesday, there's a bit of a panic, and the stock market nosedives. And so people that had bought stock on margin were now left with some losses, and they couldn't pay back those loans. So kind of all these things together lead to the Great Depression and this era of low economic activity, high unemployment, those types of things. And so, we've got that. And it had some significant effects. We've got lots of people out of work. At its height during the Great Depression, the unemployment rate, or the number of people that are out of work, reaches 25%. And so as people are out of work, obviously they're probably going to be losing their homes or farms. And so you have the rise of shanty towns, or things that later become known as Hoovervilles. And it was actually kind of coined Hoovervilles to kind of show people's dislike of Hoover himself. I mean, they named these shanty towns after him. So we have that going on. As the stock market crashes, we have banks that had bought stocks on margin just like individuals. And so banks couldn't pay back loans to other banks. And so we had banks closing, we had businesses closing. We have all those things going on. And at the outset of the Depression, we have a president in Herbert Hoover who doesn't deal with the Great Depression effectively. Remember, he had this belief in rugged individualism, or that people should kind of help themselves. And really, he did not favor direct intervention or direct relief by the government. He thought that would serve as a disincentive for people to work and those types of things. And so he didn't want to have any kind of direct relief. And so he was more about encouraging business and labor leaders to work together. And it's not effective. The only real effective thing he did was the building of the Boulder Dam, which later becomes known as Hoover Dam, out in Las Vegas or near Las Vegas. So that's about the only effective thing, and it's a model that Roosevelt will later follow, where it's building something, improving infrastructure, putting people to work at the same time. So he just did not deal with the Depression all that effectively, and ultimately loses most of his support when he decides to gas the Bonus Army, which is an incident that he really cost him his reelection bid. But obviously, the Great Depression is going to have effects on men, women, and children. It's going to have some physical effects where you have children that are malnourished, that are uneducated, but it's going to have some psychological effects as well. You look at the suicide rate, the institutionalized rate, where people going into mental hospitals, those both rose drastically. We talked about how men oftentimes really, who were used to being the provider, would get depressed to the point that they might abandon their families, and we talked about kind of the effects it's had on the women, who are now left kind of trying to keep things together. They really learned how to make the most out of what they had, whether it was through careful budgeting or making their own clothes, those types of things. We looked at how some children, especially older children, would leave their homes and go ride the rails, those types of things. And so, there's far-reaching effects to the Great Depression. And again, kind of through it all, especially in the early years, Roosevelt is just not dealing with them effectively. And so when we look at Hoover's not dealing with them effectively. When we look at Roosevelt being elected in 1932, he formulates what's known as the New Deal. And this New Deal is aimed at solving some of the problems that he faced. And so, again, we've got industries and families and farms, that had failed. And so you've got large numbers of people out of work. We've got a stock market that had crashed, banks that had closed. We have businesses that have gone bankrupt. We've got high unemployment, and we've got homelessness. And that's kind of daunting for Roosevelt to take on. But again, in his first 100 days in office, Roosevelt begins to propose solutions. And one of the very first things he does as president in his first 100 days is he closes the banks. He declares a bank holiday and has the government basically examine those banks, and then healthy banks were allowed to reopen. Unhealthy banks would remain closed. And again, the idea here is to stop those run-on banks and to stop those banks from closing. Roosevelt also passed a number of work projects that were aimed at helping the unemployed. So we've got the Civilian Conservation Corps that would fall under this category. We've got the Work Progress Administration. We've got the National Youth Administration. We've got so many things that fall kind of in that category of putting people to work. He also looks at the farming industry and said, that's one of those problems up there. How can we help that? He passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act and later the Second Agricultural Adjustment Act, aimed at kind of giving money to farmers or providing price supports to farmers, sharecroppers, and migrant workers to help people stay on their farms. Again, he also, through a lot of his programs, provided new opportunities for women and minorities. whether it's Frances Perkins and becoming the first female cabinet member, or whether it's Mary McLeod Bethune, who became the well, she was involved in the National Youth Administration, but kind of forms that black cabinet that becomes advisors to Roosevelt, on issues related to African Americans, and so we have those things going on. We also have programs like Social Security that were developed during the Great Depression era. An organization that can provide some sort of old age insurance, so people could retire comfortably. We've got the National Labor Relations Board, or the NLRB, which again is kind of a sounding board between labor and management and settle disputes. We've got the Securities and Exchange Commission that was created, which helped. You know, Basically, it was created on the Federal Securities Act, excuse me, that provided a body that could regulate the stock market, basically. We've got the FDIC, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that insured people's money into the bank. And so that restored a lot of confidence. People were more willing to put their money back in the bank. And Roosevelt started kind of this tradition of these fireside chats where he would sit down with the public and explain to them what was going on. Very helpful, especially his first one, where he kind of explained the banking system, which is something a lot of Americans would not have understood. So you've got all these solutions. Now, I don't have this written on here, but these solutions don't go without their opponents. You've got liberals who feel like Roosevelt hasn't gone far enough and he should do more to help others. Guys like Huey Long, Francis Townsend, those types of people who, again, government should be doing more. You remember with Huey Long, he had the Share Our Wealth program, and he ended up getting assassinated, but he had eyes on challenging Roosevelt for the presidency. You've got certain New Deal legislation that was actually challenged in the courts. Two of them made their way to the Supreme Court and ultimately were declared unconstitutional. One of them being the Agricultural Adjustment Act, saying its provisions should be local matters. And then the other one being the NIRA, or the National Industrial Recovery Act. Again, those two things are declared unconstitutional, to which Roosevelt tries to pack the Supreme Court. He's unsuccessful in really doing that. So you've got those opponents. You've got conservatives that are concerned with the deficit spending that Roosevelt had undertaken. So yes, these are solutions to their problems, but they didn't come. They didn't come without their opponents to them. If we look at the entire era as a whole, there are some continuing effects from it. We've got banking and finance that had been reformed. Like I said, we've got the Glass-Steagall Act, which established the FDIC. We've also got the Federal Securities Act, which established the SEC. Really kind of major pieces of legislation in reforming banking and finance. But through it all, we've got government taking a more active role in the economy, and you can kind of see that there's a litany of things where the government has become much more involved in the economy. We've got workers benefiting from labor standards that are a little bit better now because of things that were set up, like the National Recovery Administration set standards for working hours, wages, those types of things. So that's generally, Roosevelt's kind of seen as a friend of labor. So labor, typically, working conditions improve. We already mentioned above with Social Security. That's probably the largest and longest lasting impact is with Social Security. And there's some conservation efforts. Also a continuing effect as far as a lot of the programs were aimed at providing resources, whether it be the Tennessee Valley Authority or the Civilian Conservation Corps. Again, it's about providing resources or protecting our natural resources, but then just conservation efforts of individuals alone, as far as not wasting things, finding how to do more with less, those types of things. All, lasting impacts from this era.